Welcome to Common Ground on the Hill Traditions Weeks. In our 29th year here on the campus of McDaniel College. My name is Walt Michael. I'm the Executive Director and founder of Common Ground on the Hill, and we're excited to bring you our keynote lecture, which sets the tone and perhaps the conversations for our week here on the campus, actually on the virtual campus of McDaniel College. We welcome all of you, and some of you may be seeing this in real time, others may be seeing this months later. But we feel that this keynote is something that has lasting power and is very important. I was doing some reading before we started working on this earlier this afternoon, working on the presentation itself. And, you know, we all have grown up and grown used to the concept that this land was occupied by Native Americans, by indigenous people for many, many years. And of course, many years before settlers arrived here. But until I read some things recently, it really wasn't driven home to me exactly what that meant. I recently did a show, played some music down in Washington Grove in Montgomery County. And I decided to read about Washington Grove and its history. And what I found out was that there were indigenous peoples there 10,000, 12,000 years ago. And all of Montgomery County was traveled and inhabited by indigenous people from around that time. Members of the Messawomic, Susquehannock, Seneca, and Piscataway Conoy tribes lived in the area, primarily using the land as crossover territory toward rock shelters, encampments, and sizable villages near the Potomac River. And the tribal boundaries were fluid. That made me think a bit more about who these people were and how they inhabited and had been inhabiting this land for so long, and how their story had become a minor story in our minds. Oh yes, the Native Americans, the indigenous people were here first. But how much time have we spent thinking about exactly how they were here and what they did? And then I started reading about the county where we are and found out that Main Street in Westminster, right outside this window, was an indigenous people's pathway and trail, and that it hooked up with what we now know as Liberty Road, which took people all the way to the Chesapeake Bay. So we're talking about a civilization and civilizations that were much more developed than we could even imagine. I'm not quite sure where our speaker is going to go with tonight's program. And I hope I haven't stolen any of his thunder, so to speak. I wanted to show you this. This was given to me in our second year in 1996 by C. Randall Daniel Sakim. It is a native woodland flute. And he comes from the Creek people in Florida. And this has been in my office all these years, almost 30 years now. From our very beginning, our second year, we included Native American studies in our work, feeling that we needed to hear those voices that are current. So let me read you a little bit about tonight's lecture and the keynote itself, and then I'll introduce our speaker. Maryland State Arts Council Folklife Specialist Ryan Koons provides an introduction to land acknowledgements, which are statements that recognize indigenous peoples dispossessed of their land and or relationships with land by settler colonists. These statements are an effective and ethical way to begin acknowledging Indigenous sovereignty, begin correcting the stories and practices that erase Indigenous peoples' history and culture, and begin inviting and honoring the truth. So I'm hoping we're going to hear a little bit of truth tonight. Let me tell you a little bit of truth about Ryan. First time I saw Ryan, I'm going to embarrass him now, but he was a mere child. But he was more than a mere child. He was already ensconced in music, learning at the foot of his parents. He has served as a folk life specialist for Maryland Traditions, the traditional arts program of the Maryland State Arts Council, since 2020. In this position, Ryan directs the Folk Life Apprenticeship and Heritage Award programs, curates media, administers the MSAC Land Acknowledgement Project, and has oversight of the Maryland Traditions Archives, housed at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He received a doctorate in ethnomusicology from the University of California after his studies at Dickinson College, and is a certified archivist and member of several professional societies. He has taught, presented, and published on topics in archives, culture, history, and performance. And I should also say that he is one heck of a musician. He's a wonderful musician, playing the fiddle and a number of other stringed instruments that his father builds. So we're very excited to present Ryan and to learn from him tonight. And you should know that later on, after his presentation, we will let you know how to interact with him in tomorrow's class, The Search for Common Ground, at 4 p.m. Make welcome Ryan Koons.
Well, thank you so very much, Walt. It's always a pleasure to be back at Common Ground, virtually and or in person. And as Walt said, I kind of grew up at Common Ground over the years, and it explains an awful lot of why I am who I am and why I get to do the work that I get to do. I am here today representing my agency, as Walt said, Maryland State Arts Council, which is why you'll see our logo posted on these slides. And it's really nice to be able to do that, because one of the privileges that we have in Maryland Traditions at the Maryland State Arts Council is to fund the Maryland Folk Life Network, which funds, among others, Common Ground on the Hill as a regional folk life center, doing wonderful work in the Mid-Atlantic, in Middle Maryland, Central Maryland, whatever the region's actually called. It changes every now and then. So I'm planning on roughly an hour, or maybe a little less, conversation today. And then, as Walt said, we're going to actually pick up the conversation via Zoom tomorrow, Tuesday, during the Search for Common Ground. For folks who are watching this video well after the fact, if you are interested in asking questions of me, and the Search for Common Ground class has passed, towards the end of this slideshow, you will find contact information for me, and I do hope you will get in touch. So without further ado, let's dive in. For folks who are not already familiar with them, land acknowledgements are statements that recognize Indigenous peoples who have been dispossessed of their lands and relationships with land by settler colonists. Now, these statements bring attention to the tribal peoples who are now, still, and in some cases were once, local to the lands that settler colonists and institutions currently occupy. So please hear in my prose right now the fact that Indigenous folks are very much still here. They were always here, and they are still here. And that's a really important component of what land acknowledgements are. But despite the hype, despite the fact that land acknowledgements are, to coin a phrase, very sexy nowadays, they're very attractive, many people want to do them for very good reasons, they're still just a very minor way of acknowledging Indigenous sovereignty. And at least in this place that we now call Maryland, they're useful in correcting the very inaccurate impression that Native peoples are no longer here. As I've said, Native peoples do still live here. We are still occupying their lands. And of course, there are many different ways to create and to deliver land acknowledgements. They could involve reading the acknowledgement at the beginning of an event. It could involve placing it within program notes for an event. It could be publishing it in public spaces, posting it online. I've encountered one that was part of a very compelling piece of public art. The sky's the limit. As an integral part of this thing that we call land acknowledgements, there's always this constant tension. There's the importance of engaging in the practice, the fact that it is something that is worthwhile to do. But there's simultaneously the recognition that land acknowledgements are actually always problematic and performative. And they function best not as an end point, not as the end goal, but rather as a beginning, as a way to start a conversation, as a way to start education, as a way to start diving into this very, very broad topic. And by way of delving into that tension this evening and tomorrow during the search for common ground, I want to share with you some ideas on land acknowledgements from several theorists in the field of Indigenous studies in order to kind of acquaint you with this broader landscape and something of the history of this practice. And a little later in the presentation, I'll also have a link for folks who want to follow along with the Maryland State Arts Council's Land Acknowledgement Project, where most of the things I'm about to share with you can be found linked in our materials. I want to start with an idea that I found most compellingly communicated by the Australian settler scholar Patrick Wolfe, who you see here. He really has stated this particularly well, in my opinion, the idea that colonialism is not, as we are so often taught now, as we receive the information, colonialism is not a one-time event that happened in the past. Rather, more accurately, it is an ongoing series of structures that we have inherited by virtue of living as we are right now in this particular area, Maryland, in this particular continent, North America, in this particular US settler nation state. We have inherited this ongoing set of structures, which means that we are all of us embedded in settler colonialism right now. And this is one reason that land acknowledgements as a practice can be considered a very useful educational tool, precisely because they help us to begin to perceive that fact, that colonialism is not just that one-time event long ago, but in fact is ongoing. Two leading thinkers within Indigenous studies, the Unangak's Aleut education scholar Eve Tuck, who you see here in the left photograph, and her co-author, the self-defined settler of color education scholar Kay Wayne Young, have written, for folks who want to follow along, this is from their groundbreaking work called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. It's open access, available online. And they talk about something they call the cultivation of critical consciousness, which is highfalutin, fancy academic talk, referring to the ways in which we as humans change the ways we think, often in response to encountering new ideas, new ways of existing, being, living, thinking. And these ways of changing our thinking can include, for example, literature, pedagogy, curricula, and things like land acknowledgements, which can be all of the above. And Kay Wayne Young and Eve Tuck note that these things are very important, right? They aid folks in learning to see settler colonialism. They aid folks in learning how to critique settler colonialism and to maybe set aside ways of being and existing and thinking and taking and discovering that are all kind of the underpinnings of settler colonialism. But, and here's the kicker, they argue that these conscientization efforts, these ways of changing our thinking, far too often become the end goal, when in fact they function much better as a beginning. And I think that is kind of my overarching argument for tonight, that yes, do land acknowledgements. It's something that can be very worthwhile to do, but don't stop there. And we'll talk more about what next steps might look like in a moment. Moving forward in our list of thinkers in Indigenous studies, these two scholars have written one of the few, if not the only, peer-reviewed articles on land acknowledgements that I certainly encountered. There's not a large field of folks publishing on this, but there's a lot of folks who are doing the work. Louis Senyo, Tongva education scholar, who you see here on the left, and you've already met the wonderful Kay Wayne Young, co-authored an article in 2021 in which they discuss ways that settler institutions of higher education, we're talking colleges, community colleges, universities, can use this practice of land acknowledgements, again, as a beginning from which to move beyond performativity and into accountability with the land, and into, perhaps most importantly, accountability with the tribal peoples who are themselves synonymous with the land. Now, there is a group of scholars who take their idea one or two steps further. There's this trio of non-Indigenous climate and sustainability scholars who you see here, the Danish Emmeline Gram Hansen, the Canadian Nicole Schaffenacker, and the German Julia Benz. And this trio notes that moving beyond simply delivering a land acknowledgement, right, that performativity, moving beyond that requires non-Indigenous people and non-Indigenous institutions to enter into what they call right relations with tribal peoples. And when they use this term right relations, they define it as having four different characteristics: deep listening, self-reflexivity, creating space, and being in action. And what they mean by this is a call for non-Indigenous folks to first listen to tribal peoples. It's that deep listening. For the folks who are themselves listening, to learn about where they themselves are. Who am I? Where am I from? Because, of course, remember that one of the things that is inherent in this series of settler colonial structures that we've inherited is a kind of a naturalization of whiteness, of the settler origins, right? I, who am non-Indigenous, I, who am a settler, I'm just white. I'm just naturalized here, right? I'm just American. And I hope you can hear the massively heavy scare quotes I'm using here. Contrast that instead with me identifying myself as I actually am, as of British Isles and Western European, Scottish, Irish, Welsh, German ancestry, right? That means something very different once you start scratching beneath the surface. I'm not just white. That's not the phrase I wanted to come out of my mouth, but we're going to run with it. Instead, I actually have a very specific settler history coming from a very specific set of countries and coming from a specific set of time periods, and I'm on this land now, as but one example, right? That's one way to think about and go about doing that self-reflexivity. When this trio is also talking about creating space, they mean that, again, the people who are listening, presumably non-Indigenous folks, they can make themselves accountable to be led by tribal peoples in action that tribal peoples begin. Tribal peoples being in action, calling for non-Indigenous folks to perhaps engage in action with them. That's kind of the broad headline perspective of what right relations are. Listening, getting to know who you are and where you are and why you're there a lot better, and then listening to tribal folks in order to answer their call, which may be for action, it may be for lack of action. Different contexts require different methods. But of course, entering into these right relations is always going to look differently, depending on where you are and the context you're in and the time you're in. So let's look at Maryland. The place that we now call Maryland is something of a transitional zone between two broader Indigenous language families or culture groups, and I've indicated that by the difference on the maps on the left versus the maps on the right. In the kind of comparatively southern portions of the state, this oddly shaped landmass that is Maryland is a strange geographic shape there, those political borders. You have in the comparative south there Algonquin tribes, and on the comparatively northern side you have Iroquoian tribes. Algonquin tribes, as you can see, are much more numerous. They include Assateague, Choctaw, Lenape, Nanticoke, Pocomoke, Piscataway, Shawnee, as well as the Accohanic from the Powhatan Confederacy. And of the Iroquoian tribes, you of course see the Susquehannock map here, and also possibly, as Walt mentioned at the very beginning, the Massawomack, about whom we actually know surprisingly little. And for folks who are interested in the reasons behind that and what we do or don't know about the Massawomack, I encourage you to bring those questions to tomorrow's Search for Common Ground. One brief note for folks who are looking at these maps, you'll see here this Piscataway Peoples map. We at MSAC are just about to launch a very minor update to our land acknowledgement project, the products of which you're seeing here. And one of the things that will be updated is this specific Piscataway Peoples map. In brief, we mistakenly glossed over some historical facts that our update is going to bring greater attention to. There are a number of tribes in Maryland, in what's now called Maryland, who were genocided in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. And often when a tribe is genocided, it's not total. There are sometimes some refugees, some survivors, and they're often adopted into neighboring tribes. So you'll have an instance where, for example, tribe A is massacred or dies of disease or starvation or any of the numerous things that resulted in genocide. And their few survivors are taken and adopted as refugees by another tribe, who is then genocided, and their survivors are adopted into yet a third tribe. Using this very brief headline version of history, that third tribe is the 4 Piscataway tribes that exist today in Maryland, and tribes A and B that are now genocided also had land relationships that we represent here in these middle and yet lighter yellow colors in this map, which I'm sure is very difficult to see. And you can find this map on our website, msac.org. Piscataway peoples today are almost exclusively recognizing the southern 3 counties in Maryland as their traditional homelands, and our update to this program and project is going to correct this map and account for the historically genocided tribes whose land are in our project currently inaccurately represented as Piscataway. So please stay tuned, more will be coming your way. I'm going to talk for a moment about indigenous erasure. I've just alluded to it in part of the previous slide, but it's worth going in depth here. When we talk about indigenous erasure, these are processes that essentially remove Native peoples from literal physical places and also from narratives. And indigenous erasure is widespread in Maryland, it's widespread in the entirety of the US, it's widespread across the Americas. Recall that the Americas, North, Central, South America, are all indigenous land that are claimed by non-indigenous settler governments for the most part. And that means that because we recognize the sovereignty of those non-indigenous settler governments, first, that's the most visible, in other words. That is to say that the indigenous folks have been erased. Sometimes unintentionally, most of the times quite intentionally. Settler colonialism as a project, in order to validate itself, thereby has to invalidate indigenous people. It has to remove them from places and narratives. And various tactics that have been used for the past several hundred years and still today include a variety of tactics. For example, forced assimilation. You might have encountered the histories of Indian boarding school education programs. That's one type of assimilation. There are others. We're also talking about forced removals of tribal peoples from their lands and other forms of land theft. I'm sure you're familiar with the existence of the Trail of Tears, which is one of the more infamous. We're also talking about quite literal murder, massacre, disease. We're talking about things that might be more insidious and less direct. For example, penalizing the practice of traditional ceremonies or the speaking of traditional languages. We're talking about also the destruction of and taking over of sacred lands, of burial grounds. We're talking about the creation and maintenance of national narratives and myths that ignore the presence and the contributions of Native peoples. I think we in Maryland might have that particular tactics used a little more often than other places, just because the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., is in our literal backyard. There's an awful lot of national myth-making that's happening localized to D.C., right? And part of that myth-making, in order to validate the U.S. settler nation state's government, necessarily involves removing, erasing indigenous folks who are very much still here. So these tactics over the past 500 years have really combined to the point where now many folks in the Americas, many folks in Maryland are completely unaware that there are still Native people living here on their traditional lands. And that is the point where Maryland State Arts Council's Land Acknowledgement Project comes in. Now, a brief introduction. You know, I work for the Maryland State Arts Council. You see our logo here in the upper corner of this presentation. We are a state government agency. Our function, our legislated function, is to take a very small portion of your tax dollars. If you're a constituent, if you live in Maryland, a very small portion of your tax dollars comes to us, and we convert your tax dollars into arts grants for independent artists and for arts organizations. And this is awesome because it means that we get to support artists and the work that they're doing. And it also means that because we are working with the public, because we're working with constituents, with Maryland residents, that we also listen to you, our constituents, and ask you to help us steer our course. And since 2020 and well before, we at Maryland Traditions and MSAC writ large received an unusually large number of requests from constituents for information on, for resources on land acknowledgements. How do you do them? How do you create them? And the questions that we received most often is, whose land are we on? We don't know, and we don't know how to figure it out. So these requests became essentially the programmatic rationale for us to initiate the MSAC Land Acknowledgement Project in 2020. And you see, we first established goals and a project framework, and we knew based off of your requests that we wanted to create a public resource on land acknowledgements. And I'll give you a QR code to that in a moment if you want to follow along with it. But at the same time, we also observed that tribal peoples formed a very, very small portion of the funding applications that we received over the years, and that we hoped that by engaging in this project and developing relationships with tribes, that we might be able to make them more aware of funding opportunities that we have available, and also to provide them with the technical assistance and make them aware that we have that technical assistance that we make available to each and every constituent in the state. The project followed a nothing for us without us. So that meant that we began with existing Indigenous former grantees and with the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs. If you're not already familiar with the commission, it is a government entity that functions as a kind of communications clearinghouse, connecting the dots between tribal communities, tribal individuals, Maryland state government agencies, and also applicable nonprofits. Based off of those relationships, we were then able to extend formal invitations to leaders and representatives of almost every tribe on whose lands are claimed by the state. One tribe never responded. One said no thank you, very politely. And two continue to discuss options for participation. And I hope that they will have time, interest, and capacity in the near future to turn their maybe into a yes. But of course, as sovereign nations, it is totally within their rights to say, no thank you, we're not interested. But the other 8 tribes whose lands are claimed by Maryland said yes, and that is frankly a huge compliment to us. I was not expecting such a positive response. I'm from the government, we're here to help. Governments have screwed Native peoples for centuries, and I represent a government. This project is coming from a government. So it's entirely logical that tribes would want to say, no, thank you, we're not interested, we don't trust you. So again, a huge compliment to us, and yet another reason why we wanted to do this project as nothing for us without us, doing this with tribal input and do it as ethically as possible. So we consulted with tribes one at a time, and we recorded those conversations for later archival accession into the Maryland Traditions Archives, which is at Special Collections at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. It is a public archives. If you want to review that stuff, you are welcome to do so, and I invite you to do so. And if you have questions about how to go about doing that, my email is at the end and can be found through a quick Google search. Again, we were very complimented that the consultants on this project from the tribes were kind of a who's who of Indigenous Maryland. And they included 7 current or former chiefs, tribal chairs or tribal speakers, 6 tribal historians or preservation officers, numerous tradition bearers, current and former commissioners from the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs, a retired employee of Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, which is awesome. And if you haven't visited, I encourage you to do so, as well as a former federal commissioner of Indian Affairs. So we did these consultations. I then went about the process of compiling all of the information that they kindly shared with us into a web page and a project resource guide. And I should note here that as part of these consultations that we paid tribal representatives for their time and for their labor. Pay artists what they're worth. We try to put our money where our mouth is. Here is this very brief screenshot of that resource guide. If you're following along online, you're welcome to find this resource and a bunch of other things at the URL listed at the top here, msac.org/resources/land-acknowledgements. And for folks with a phone handy, there's a QR code that will take you directly there. I invite you to check these materials out. The screenshot you see here on the right, this resource guide, is kind of the gold, the meat of the matter, if you will. It's a public-facing document on a government agency website, right? So that means that it had to go through a wide variety of checks, reviews that is required for any and everything that gets published on our government website. And I should note that one of those reviews included, unusually, a review by staff in the governor's office. This was then Governor Larry Hogan, and he and his staff approved it. But most importantly, it was reviewed by the tribes, and they approved, and in a few cases requested edits too, but finally approved the final representations of themselves for the public. And so now this document, this webpage, now include an overview of what land acknowledgement statements are and how to craft them. It includes information on the project itself, some of the information that I've been sharing with you tonight or today or whenever you're watching this on repeat. It also includes information on each of the tribes that we consulted, and that includes their history, a description of their land relationships, a map. Please note again that the Piscataway map is up for editing, and also a land acknowledgement statement. And in a few instances, the land acknowledgement statement within this document was actually authored by tribal elders themselves. There's also an additional resources section that features a wide variety of peer-reviewed and or researched literature on land acknowledgements and tribal histories. And kind of the gold within the gold, the gilded lily, if you will, at the center of this document is the key concepts section, which functions as a kind of a localized Maryland local Indigenous Studies 101 class. Common Ground folks behind the scenes, we just stopped the recording. I don't know if that's a problem, but just so you're aware, I just heard that announcement. Moving right along with the presentation, I want to share with you some information about the place where Common Ground is located, where I live now, in Carroll County, Maryland. I'll tell you right now that we don't know nearly as much as I'd like to about Indigenous histories and realities of this place that is called Carroll County. Kind of a downside of our statewide project is that because we were necessarily looking at the entire state and all of the landscapes, tribes, relationships with lands there, we did not have the luxury of time to be able to delve into localized histories. And that is a major downside and something that I hope to be able to correct in the future. So that is to say that our project primarily focuses on tribal peoples who are living today, and it provides a kind of a general, more regionalized history. And sometimes that's all you can get. There's a very frustrating component to this work that sometimes there are things that are going to always be unknowable. Genocide is no joke. It is literally the death of people and their memories and their histories and their thoughts and their philosophies and their ways of life. And that is a massive detriment. And that information in some instances is no longer accessible to us because of genocide. But there's some other reasons why that information might not be available to us today. Colonial records that were written down sometimes have a wealth of information, but those records often exhibit bias and are very spotty, no matter where you are. They didn't capture everything. It was impossible to do anyway, but sometimes they really didn't capture that much. But there's also some other things very locally to us that make it difficult to have captured some of this information or to be able to access some of this information now. You might be aware of the fact that Carroll County is in the part of Maryland known as the Piedmont, and our Piedmont erodes sometimes rather quickly. And in some parts of the archaeological history of this area, Maryland was as damp or damper as it is now, and humidity and dampness literally cause things to rot quicker than they can be accessioned, if you will, into the archaeological record. So what genocide didn't already do, rain and humidity did. So there's, again, a lot that we don't know because of genocide, rain, and humidity. But what we do know is that tribal peoples have been here for at least the past 13,000 years. And of course, because of the temporal distance and because of the humidity and the erosion and the spotty colonial records, we don't know what they themselves called themselves. We know that they moved around a fair amount. We know that tribal peoples across the Chesapeake Bay watershed prior to colonial contact, that is to say, John Smith and other early colonists, tended to observe a tradition where they would live in comparatively permanent settlements closer to the mouths of rivers as they emptied into the Chesapeake Bay. That would be where their permanent dwellings would be. That would be where their agriculture would be practiced. And then seasonally, they would migrate comparatively upriver to a river of the fall line. The fall line, by the way, is the geological term. It's actually the 95 corridor as it happens, but it's where the Piedmont erodes into the coastal plain. And tribal folks pre-contact would migrate up to and upriver of the fall line in order to seasonally hunt. Now, between 500 BC, so we're talking about 500 years before Christ, by the current way of measuring time, and so between 500 BC and 1100 AD, so we're talking about early medieval period in Europe, for comparison. This is a period of history, a period of archaeological history that archaeologists call the woodland period. And during this time period, tribal peoples engaged in a lot of what the archaeologists call landscape modification. And this was primarily achieved at the local level through a series of regularly scheduled burns, literally setting fire to the landscape. These burns were actually incredibly useful in maintaining a series of areas for grazing, for animals to graze in, so that during those seasonal migrations for hunting, you would essentially have a pantry full of critters to be able to hunt. And something I think still boggles my mind. We're so used to, in Maryland, of course, thinking about all the tree cover, right? It's a very tree-heavy state, and I love that fact. But historically, that was not always the case in every part of the state. Large portions of the mid-Atlantic used to be grassland prairies, not dissimilar looking to the Western plains that you see now. And the habitat islands at the center of these plains, these grasslands, if you look in this map here, you can see the political borders here. Here's Pennsylvania, here's the Mason-Dixon line with Maryland, here's Baltimore City. You see these kind of black squiggles here in the Piedmont region of the state of Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland. These black squiggles denote locations of a mineral called serpentinite. And on the right side of the screen here, you will see an example of what serpentinite looks like. It's a kind of a grayish, blackish, brownish mineral. It's very pretty. Serpentinite has nothing to do with snakes. Don't quite know how that connection arrived, but it is important to the story here because the soils that serpentinite result in when they break down actually have very low nutrition. It's a very low nutritional value soil. So that means that the plants that adapt to and or survive a serpentinite soil tend to be very small, very stunted looking. They don't grow much because, again, there's not much food there for them to draw on. The reason this is important is that if you've got a series of ecologies that have low height plants to begin with, they tend to be or look very much like grasslands. So tribal folks pre-contact would burn these lands and would burn the lands around them in order to create these prairies that would attract game animals, such as bison, buffalo were this far east. We do actually know this, but also white-tailed deer, also elk, bear, turkey. Again, as I said earlier, these savannas essentially functioned as a kind of a seasonal pantry for tribal peoples. And of course, all of these ecologies, this landscape existed at the time of contact. If you go back to the colonial record, the colonial writing of the British colonists, you'll find a large variety of references to variously the Maryland barons, the Baltimore barons, the Lancaster barons, as in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and even the Virginia barons, and that's B-A-R-R-E-N-S, referring to a barren landscape, essentially these long-held burned prairies. But of course, with the intrusion of settlers and the advent of so-called written history, moving on from archaeological history, tribals folks' relationships with their lands were changed, and those burns essentially stopped as those relationships were sundered. But because of, we're trying to triangulating between what we know and what we don't know, we know that many of the tribal peoples who were in these areas And you'll notice here, by the way, I should notice for folks seeing this, I know this is probably a little too small. This squiggle here is the Susquehanna River. So named after Susquehannock tribal peoples who maintained relationships with this land as well as others. And of course, there's also evidence that the Delaware and the Lenape peoples, same tribe, different name, maintained relationships with these lands, as likely did Shawnee peoples. Again, we're talking local to Carroll County here, or what's now called Carroll County. Now I want to take a deep dive for a moment into this. Oh, I beg your pardon. Here's a picture that I meant to show you a moment ago. This is one of the last few remaining contiguous, the largest contiguous serpentinite savannas in the world, or on the eastern seaboard. I can definitely say that, maybe not in the world. This is at Soldiers Delight Natural Wildlife Area. This is just down the road for folks in Carroll County. This is just down the road in Owings Mills, Maryland, in Baltimore County. And you can see, although there are some trees here, and that's an ecology that the burns would have impeded. There would not have been trees here at this pre-contact. But you see here, it looks an awful lot like a bit of a prairie, doesn't it? And that is what a portion of Maryland looked like back at the time. Now, I want to take a bit of a dive into the Susquehannock peoples. The tribal confederacy that we today call Susquehannock are part of an Iroquoian language and culture family. And the name Susquehannock itself is actually an English language transliteration by settlers in Maryland and Virginia, British colonies, of a Powhatan exonym. Exonym is a word that derives from outside of the particular place or community. So that is to say, it is a word that is not Susquehannock. It is actually a word that the settlers heard from neighboring tribes. Folks up in Pennsylvania, settlers up in Pennsylvania, called the same confederacy the Conestoga. And I should note, if I can go back a few slides to the Carroll County logo here, that is a Conestoga wagon. You'll notice some indigenous erasure there in the fact that that's the only thing representing Carroll County in that logo. But returning to the Susquehannock, the Pennsylvania folks, settlers called Susquehannock folks Conestoga after one of the last remaining Susquehannock villages in present-day Lancaster County, and I'll talk about that in a moment. A little further north, up towards New York, where the Susquehannock River's headwaters are, Dutch and Swedish settlers up there called the same people the Minquas, which word itself derives from another exonym, this time from the Lenape, who at the time were essentially the traditional enemy of the Susquehannock. So it's entirely possible that Minqua might be something of a racial epithet, if you speak Lenape, which I do not. There are a number of treaties that document the official relationship, so to speak, between Susquehannock tribal peoples and the English colony. I want to share with you two of them, kind of the two most famous, or I suppose perhaps also infamous, although infamous or famous for very, very different reasons. The one you see here that is dated 1652 in July, ceded land around the northern rim of the Chesapeake Bay, and I'm going to go back one slide so you can see on our map this kind of lighter yellow color that rims the bay from Calvert County down here all the way up and around to Talbot County. That land is, as far as we can guess, the land represented within this treaty that you see here. And I'm going to go back here. This treaty defines the northern boundaries and the southern boundaries very minutely. From the Patuxent River, which is the boundary between St. Mary's and Calvert counties down here in southern Western Shore, all the way up to, where is it? It's the, up to present-day Garrett Island at the mouth of the Susquehannock River. And then on the eastern shore, the treaty defines the land as from the Choptank River, so that's here where Talbot and Dorchester counties meet, all the way up to the Northeast Branch River, which is near present-day Elkton, here at the head of the bay. Everything else, land-wise, is not defined. So we don't know how far to the west on the western shore or how far to the east on the eastern shore this treaty actually focused on. There's no way of knowing this. It could have just been a few miles. It could have been a few hundred miles. We've made the best guess that we can with our shading here. But it's entirely possible that the place that is Carroll County could be included in this treaty. We really genuinely have no way of knowing. I should talk for a moment, and we've got the time, about treaties. in general. Treaty making in any indigenous context in the Americas was always an uneven playing field. And this is a very important component of the history to understand the importance of treaties, but to also understand the ways in which the treaty creating process disenfranchised the tribal folks, who were half of the parties at the table making these treaties. So consider, you're being asked by the invaders to have this conversation not in your native language, so a foreign language. Those of us who speak more than one language know that the minute gradations in meaning in any different set of words that are chosen can change the meaning so drastically. And if you don't speak that language very, very well, those gradations of meaning can be completely lost. How easy then to take advantage of tribal folks who do not speak the language in which the treaty is being made. This treaty was in English. Tribal folks might speak English, but at this point, they might not speak it as their native tongue. Consider also that tribal folks, in some instances, not all, were often at a disadvantage. So we're essentially being bullied to the treaty-making table by the colonists. Again, not always. There are many instances of tribal folks having quite a bit of agency, but more often than not, disenfranchisement was the name of the game. But perhaps most insidiously, and this particular treaty that you see here is one example of this insidiousness, many of these treaties required of Native peoples to do things that quite literally did not exist within their worldviews. Consider, for example, land. We, all of us who grew up in this kind of mainstream Euro-American worldview, we think of land as something that you can own, you can draw boundaries around it. This is my land, that is your land, here's the boundary, don't you dare cross it. I can do on my land whatever I want. I can extract from it, I can hold wild parties on it, and except perhaps for a noise complaint, there's probably not much you who have land over there and not here can really do about it, right? We're talking about land as something that can be owned, something that can be extracted from. This is a cultural concept that is wildly different from many indigenous worldviews, where land and ecologies are not things that you can own, they are not things that you can extract from, they are relatives who support you and with whom you live in relationship. There's a wonderful indigenous scholar, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's Potawatomi, and she once summed it up talking about language that you don't refer to your grandmother as it. It is cooking, it is knitting, it is sitting in the chair over there. In English, those all sound wildly inappropriate, right? If you're talking about your grandmother, your mother, your brother, a literal human relative, right? And in many indigenous cosmologies, worldviews at the time of contact, and in many indigenous cosmologies still today, land is a relative to relate to, not something that you can own. So then if you're being asked within this treaty process to give up your land, how can you? How can you give up access to rights to your grandmother, your sibling? It's a concept that is what we call mutually exclusive. They don't work in the same way at all in the two different worldviews here at the table making this treaty. But then there's also an additional problem when we're talking about land. If land is a relative, how do you define whose land it is? As we go back to this map here, right? We know that Susquehannock peoples lived, especially up here, further north along the Susquehannock River. That's where their villages were. They lived and hunted down here in this broad band of color, this yellow color in here from Hartford through Montgomery counties in Maryland. But are you ceding just land that you live on, that you perform agriculture on? Are you being asked to cede land that you hunt on, just occasionally once a year, that you travel through, that you go to only for very specific purposes, maybe once every generation only? How does that incommensurate concept connect to this concept of ownership that you're being asked to give up through this treaty-making process? So you can see how this thing is very uneven, it's unequal, it's difficult to talk about, even still today, because of the ways in which these worldviews are so different. I want to move on to the other famous Susquehannock treaty. I love this one. It's famous for a very, very different reason. Instead of disenfranchisement of tribal peoples, you'll notice here two pictograph signatures by Susquehannock tribal leaders from the 1666 treaty. And this is a terrapin, a type of turtle native to Maryland, and this is a fox. And this treaty, this very important document, demonstrates through these signatures by tribal leaders the importance to them and their communities of these species, of these, and really functionally serve to demonstrate to us now today this deeper multi-species connection that tribal peoples maintained and continue to maintain prior to and during early colonization and still today. Susquehannock peoples, as a polity, as a distinct tribal group, were genocided in 1763. You might have heard of the Paxton riots in Pennsylvania, in Lancaster County. The Paxton riots resulted in the massacre or the murder of the Conestoga village, the last village of the Susquehannock. So there are today no Susquehannock chiefs, polities, councils, but there are still Susquehannock peoples. I mentioned earlier histories in which often, even when a tribe is genocided, that genocide is almost never total, right? And you'll have refugees who are adopted into neighboring tribes, and that is a classic example of what happened to the Susquehannock peoples. So today, you will find Susquehannock peoples as members of other tribes, Shawnee, Lenape, Piscataway, lineages that are enrolled in any of those tribes and a few others that maintain the knowledge that we are descended from the Susquehannock. And we are very fortunate in our MSAC land acknowledgement project to have consulted with several folks who were Susquehannock Lenape and Susquehannock Shawnee. Returning to Carroll County, though, specifically, and Walt alluded to this at the very beginning in the introduction, we do know that tribal folks in Carroll maintained a series of paths to get from point A to point B, C, D, ad infinitum, into Z and beyond. And we continue to use these roads still today. Walt mentioned one of them. Folks locally might be familiar with Maryland Route 30 between Hanover and Reisterstown. I traveled that just the other day. That was also known as the Conestoga Road, which you'll notice, of course, is the name of the last Piscataway tribal community. That was pretty important tribal road, and it is still an often traveled road today. There's also Maryland Route 194, which travels from Tawnytown to Frederick, another important tribal route. Now, there is an unfortunate byproduct of this broad lack of knowledge about specific and local tribal histories. You'll notice that I'm kind of digging deep to be able to share with you anything local to Carroll County, because again, folks were genocided, stuff eroded, stuff rotted. There's a lot that we don't know. And one byproduct of this lack of visibility of tribal histories in Carroll specifically and far beyond Carroll is that it results in the assumption on the part of non-Indigenous folks that tribal peoples were not here, or if they were, they're certainly not here now. So therefore, this land was ripe for the taking. And this narrative is all very much bound up within this manifest destiny myth that I remembered learning about in K through 12 school. I think it must have been high school social studies, that underscores, that forms the foundation, this manifest destiny of the historical formation and land theft of the United States as a nation state. And when you consider that many of the tribal communities across the Americas considered land as a relative to relate to rather than property to own and extract from, this assumption that land is there to be taken becomes laughable. So with you all giggling along with me, and in the few moments that we have remaining, I want to return to land acknowledgements as a practice and share with you a series of recommendations of what you do next. You've created your land acknowledgement, you've delivered it, you've hopefully learned something in the process, and you might continue to learn more as you delve deeper. But what do you do next? In June 2021, yes, Maryland Traditions hosted a webinar entitled Land Acknowledgement 2.0, which is available for free on the Maryland State Arts Council's YouTube page. I invite you to watch it. It features a number of tribal elders and leaders who consulted on our project, and our guests shared a variety of ways that they recommend for non-Indigenous folks to move into accountability with the land and into accountability with the Indigenous folks who are still synonymous with the land. And I'd like to share some of these with you now. Elders recommended, of course, learning about the local tribal histories. Our project materials include some resources to help constituents do this. The Maryland State Archives has recently published a brand new database with a large volume of resource there. It's called MAYIS, M-A-Y-I-S. Highly recommend you check that out. That provide you with resources. And when you're looking for resources or deciding which ones to go through, I highly recommend giving preference to those that are peer-reviewed and or derive from non-Indigenous folks or trusted sources like an archive. Tribal elders also recommended donating to the tribes on whose land you live or work on. Money can be very helpful for all of us, tribes notwithstanding. They also recommended, of course, returning lands to tribes. You might have encountered on social media and in various publications a concept that is typically expressed as #landback, all one word. This refers to the returning of stolen lands to tribes. And I do want to note that there appears to be an increase in land back across North America just in the past few years. We've not had any in Maryland yet. Maybe that will change, I hope. But relatively locally to us, the Lenape tribe and the Nanticoke tribe, both in Delaware late 2021, received land back. Excuse me, and the Rappahannock tribe received land back in March in Virginia in March 2022. Elders also recommended establishing MOUs or contracts with tribes so that the tribes can access land and or resources that are owned by your institution free of charge. For folks who are watching this who might represent a particular type of institution, what that means is going to look very different depending on what it is that your institution does. This could, for example, be colleges or universities making your research materials free of charge, accessible to tribal communities. It could be theaters making your venues free of charge or your tickets free of charge to tribal communities. The sky is the limit, and you might want to start the conversation with tribal peoples themselves to see what it is that you have that they might find of use or helpful to them. And you might be surprised by what it is that they tell you. Tribal elders also recommended stewarding the lands that folks own or control. And Cherokee literature scholar Joseph M. Pierce has written on this point, and I want to share his quote with you. I think it says it particularly well. He said, quote, "A land acknowledgement is not the same as a relationship. Land does not require that you confirm it exists or that it has been stolen. Rather, land requires that you reciprocate the care the land has given to you." Reciprocating care with land will look differently place by place. It might mean perhaps cleaning up a trash dumping site that is local to you. It might mean advocating with your local authority on points of stormwater control or erosion. It might look like chemical cleanup or talking about that with your local authority. In other areas, and frankly, most areas, it could look like learning about invasive and native species locally to you and working to support local bird and insect populations with native plants. And for folks in Maryland, there are a variety of resources available to you that can help you do that. The Maryland Native Plant Society is one of them. Nationally, the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation provides excellent resources, but there's always local nature parks and centers, local libraries, all have a wide variety of resources that can help you delve into different ways to healthfully support and steward the lands that you own. I also want to draw attention to the Homegrown National Park effort. This has been spearheaded by the celebrated ecologist Doug Tallamy, who teaches over at the University of Delaware. I also recommend that you check out his books if you're not familiar with them. He does an excellent job of translating some of the more esoteric science stuff into layman's terms. And speaking as somebody who is not a scientist, I know that I heartily appreciate that. So with that, I am going to draw this keynote lecture to a close. Folks who are watching this, I very much hope you will join us tomorrow at 4 p.m. at the Search for Common Ground. This will again be virtual on Zoom, 4 p.m. to 5:30 tomorrow, Tuesday, June 27th. And I look forward to your probing questions. Please put me on the spot. There are a lot of different ways that can be done, and I look forward to your grilling. Walt, anything to add and sum up?
Well, thank you so much, Ryan. This was very informative. And when you talked about the land back movement, I went up online as you were speaking and confirmed that, yes, I did remember this correctly. When I was just out of Western Maryland College, I visited a friend named Rich McKenna, who was out in Nebraska on Ponca land. And there was a land back thing that happened there in 2014. It's very moving. So anybody that wants to look at that can go just Google Ponca land back Nebraska, and you'll see this thing where this farmer gave back, a certain amount of acreage to the Ponca tribe, and they started raising, corn from original seeds and all that sort of thing. But it is something that could be done. I'm, where my mind is going. What about the McDaniel Environmental Center? I know that was in its farming days was a grain farm. It was not a dairy farm; it was a grain farm. And I'm gonna wager that on that creek somewhere there were some indigenous people for thousands of years growing grain, probably. But thank you so much. And we do look forward to seeing people at 4:00 tomorrow. That is Tuesday. And also, I believe we'll have that archived as well. And thank you, Ryan.
Thank you. And for folks who are watching this stream as a repeat well after the fact, if you have any questions or wish to connect, I invite you to do so. You can contact me via the information here on the screen, ryan.koons@maryland.gov, or my office phone number if you want to talk to me. But please be in touch. These are conversations that need to continue, and I look forward to your thoughts.
Wonderful.